I want to read to you from Bruce Tift's book called Already Free. And this is chapter 4. It's about anxiety. Jerome was a lawyer in his late 40s. He arrived at my office in a shirt and tie on his lunch break from a job as the junior partner at a local firm. Despite his well put together appearance, he had come to see me because he felt unsuccessful at work and in relationships with women. Upon further discussion, he reported that he was not as assertive as he wanted to be, and he was feeling a lack of aliveness and effectiveness in his life as a whole. He found it hard to be himself when he was dating women, and at work he tended to placate or please. He worked more hours than his colleagues, doing what he could to avoid conflict. But the results were leaving him unsatisfied and frustrated. I asked Jerome to imagine what it would be like to assert himself more effectively in any of these parts of his life. To stick up for himself in a conflict at the office, or to disagree with a woman he was dating. He laughed nervously and said that even the thought made him feel uncomfortable. So I dug a little deeper and asked him what he would have to feel if he were to say no to a colleague. Rather than answering the question, Jerome started rationalizing his passive approach. He started talking about the potential consequences of initiating conflict, how he didn't want people to be mad at him, he didn't want to hurt their feelings, he hated being yelled at, and just wanted people to get along with each other. I invited Jerome back to the present moment and asked him again what he was feeling in his immediate experience. Once he put his attention on his body, he was able to say that he was feeling tightness in his stomach, a little nausea, and a generalized nervousness. A couple of times he returned to his concerns about the consequences of conflict, and each time he was surprised when I pointed out that he had left his immediate experience. He wasn't even aware of his own impulse to dissociate from his immediate experience of disturbing sensations and to jump into interpretation. Each time I guided him back to the present moment, I asked, what sensations do you feel in your body as you imagine leaving your job at 5 o'clock and not taking work home for the weekend? I was not, of course, suggesting that he actually leave the office at 5 o'clock. We were not discussing behavioral changes at this point. I was simply using a hypothetical situation to see what energies or feelings might arise if he were to face a situation that he had been avoiding. It didn't take long to discover that the feelings and sensations that he'd been avoiding at work were the same feelings and sensations he was avoiding in his relationships and in other unsatisfying areas of his life. They were sensations of anxiety, tightness in his chest, a faster heartbeat, a sense of nausea, a feeling of suffocation, and so on. These same feelings would come up whether he imagined conflict with potential partners, setting boundaries at work, speaking honestly with his parents, or disagreeing with a friend. It turned out that his behavior in each of these situations was crafted to avoid the very vulnerable and very disturbing experience that we call anxiety. Okay. Next section is titled, Anxiety as a Natural Response. For most of us, anxiety is an incredibly difficult experience to work with. It seems we have a collective societal fantasy that we're not supposed to feel anxious. Often we will relate to our experience of anxiety as evidence that there's something wrong with us or there's something wrong with our lives. We don't feel comfortable when we're anxious, and other people don't feel comfortable around us. Anxiety feels like a problem that needs to be fixed. But in my experience, anxiety is completely legitimate and valid. if not pleasant, it's a completely, start over. But in my experience, anxiety is a completely legitimate and valid, if not pleasant, aspect of being human. Each of us has to learn to work with anxiety skillfully because it is part of our everyday experience. I know that I feel anxious every day. Maybe it's because I wasn't paying attention as I was driving and I swerved out of my lane. Or maybe I find myself wondering if our kids are okay. I might be anxious about some conflict with my wife or nervous about paying a bill. I may feel anxious with no obvious explanation. I don't think I've ever met anybody who doesn't experience anxiety as an ongoing part of life. So anxiety is not a choice. The choice is how we relate to it. Do we attack this disturbing experience with fundamental aggression, trying not to feel it, making it wrong, or distracting ourselves? Or do we approach anxiety with an attitude of commitment to and acceptance of this disturbing experience? Because anxiety is real, it's us. It's not some alien feeling happening to us. A life without anxiety is not an option. He takes a little note here to say, for purposes of this chapter, I'll be talking about what could be called emotional or existential anxiety. I'm not talking about the kind of anxiety that results from brain chemistry imbalances, hormones, or other medical problems. These biologically based experiences of anxiety usually need biologically based interventions regarding sleep, experimenting with diet, making sure we exercise, possibly even medication. These interventions are all very appropriate. But here we're talking about the type of anxiety that we all live with. Anxiety that doesn't seem to be caused by a neurological or hormonal problem. The anxiety of everyday human existence. When we're feeling anxious, generally we sense that there's some sort of impending threat. Intense physical sensations arise, which energize us and focus our attention on the search for danger. There's often a sense of imminent catastrophe, which is interesting because often we can't even name what it is that we're actually anxious about. Anxiety is an immediate response to a possible threat, which is different from fear. Fear is an immediate response to an immediate threat. For example, if we're hiking in the forest and suddenly hear a loud noise, we'll likely feel some fear. If we're hiking and we feel anxious, on the other hand, it's because there's possibility of danger. We're worried about what could happen rather than what is happening. In this way, anxiety serves almost like a preparation for our survival response. It's getting us ready for the possibility of danger. Both fear and anxiety are at the center of our biology. These basic survival responses have certainly been around much longer than we humans have been on the planet. Our species probably wouldn't be here if we didn't have fear and anxiety. If our ancestors had felt only peaceful and happy and just sunned themselves on a rock all day, some wild animal probably would have eaten them up. The threat response is a necessary part of the evolutionary process. And perhaps for the same evolutionary reasons, anxiety seems to be very contagious. For example, if a single bird in a flock gets startled, in a fraction of a second, the entire flock will take off. The same goes for a herd of deer or a family of prairie dogs. Interestingly, it's not that different among us humans. Most of us have had the experience of becoming anxious simply because somebody we care about is feeling that way. If a loved one feels angry, jealous, or confused, we usually don't feel the same feeling. For some reason, we can keep more distance, probably because these feelings are not a signal of imminent threat to our survival. But the anxiety response is deeply embedded in our makeup, which makes it very contagious and very difficult to work with. It's difficult to work with anxiety because we seem to be biologically wired to avoid it, if at all possible, or to escape from whatever is triggering it. If anxiety were a signal of real imminent danger, this, of course, would be an intelligent response. We would want to get away from the danger as quickly as possible. But as modern humans, we experience life beyond the biological level of the physical survival. We're having emotional, cognitive, social, and spiritual experiences too. And when there's disturbance on any of these levels, we seem to respond in a fraction of a second to the possibility of a threat, as if it were a biological signal. Evolutionarily, it is better to be safe than sorry. And because we don't take time to examine this anxiety in detail, we react as if it is literal, like as if our physical survival actually is at risk. What has become clear, though, through Western developmental work is that most of us learn to organize our survival strategies around the avoidance of certain feelings, thoughts, and sensations, especially those associated with intense levels of anxiety. Okay, the next section here is anxiety and our disowned feelings. From the Western perspective, anxiety is basically a developmental phenomenon. In the first years of life, we are subjected to intense emotions and sensations that we are really not capable of processing. These intense, energetic, emotional experiences threaten to overwhelm our very fragile sense of self, our ability to function. Thus, they can provoke intense anxiety in us. To disconnect from the anxiety, we quickly construct internal fences to separate our conscious experiencing from these disturbing emotions. These fences or defenses may include repression, regression, projection, intellectualization, dissociation, and so on. Whatever our style, we're basically trying to get away from the perceived threat. In the process, we sacrifice a part of ourselves, the part that is feeling disturbed. We cut off from those emotions so that our more conscious sense of self can operate relatively free from anxiety. And as we have discussed, however, the cost of doing this is a fundamental sense of being divided against ourselves. We create a character structure, a positive self, sometimes called ego, which is associated with the ability to function and survive. And a negative not self, created out of the disturbing energies that we are not willing to feel. When young, this anxiety avoidance strategy is healthy and intelligent. It's very appropriate and very creative. In fact, it requires incredible discipline to learn how to not feel what we're actually feeling in a consistent way. But by organizing our character structure around this avoidance of these unworkably intense feelings, such as grief, rage, fear, we paradoxically place these worst fears at the center of ourselves, at the center of our sense of self. Okay, this is what Jerome, the client we met at the beginning of this chapter, had done. Over the course of a handful of sessions, Jerome started to examine the possibility that what was common across all the problem areas in his life was the avoidance of anxiety. He discovered that the anxiety he felt was pretty much the same in all these areas. There wasn't a different anxiety for a relationship or another for work, for example. He started to see that the experience of anxiety had been part of his life, perhaps for his whole life. He remembered feeling it as an adolescent, when applying to law school, when taking the bar exam. He could remember feeling anxious when he left home alone or when his parents would fight. When he recognized that he'd been feeling anxious, on and off for as long as he could remember, he became more open to the possibility that anxiety was a valid and necessary part of his human experience, even if he didn't like it. To help him become more tolerant of his own anxiety, I had Jerome close his eyes and do a visualization. I asked him to stretch his arm out as far as it could go and imagine that his hand was holding the feeling of this experience of being anxious. I had him try to get as far away from it as he could. And of course, his anxiety would still be part of him. He can't actually leave it behind. In the visualization, I suggested he try to walk forward while attempting to leave the anxiety behind. The anxiety is still in his hand, so if he's not willing to bring the anxiety with him, he'll end up walking in a circle. I had Jerome visualize himself just rotating around and around that central feeling, all the while pretending it wasn't there. This is what happens to us when we divide ourselves against feeling certain emotions or sensations. We are walking forward through life as if things were settled and taken care of, but secretly massive amounts of our awareness, intelligence, discipline, and creativity are going towards making sure we never have to be aware of that disturbance, of our disturbance. Ironically, the result is that we begin to organize our lives around this central feeling that we're avoiding. We end up walking in a circle when we think we're moving forward. If we're lucky, by the time we're in our 30s or 40s, we start to wake up to these repetitive habitual patterns. We become curious about and sort of mystified by why we keep recreating the same painful dramas over and over. We can see that the behaviors are not to our benefit, but we don't seem to be able to stop them. This is when we need to investigate the possibility that we're basically maintaining these patterns as a ritualized avoidance strategy. We're behaving almost like a planet rotating around the sun. This very experience that we've dedicated our life to not feeling, whether it's loneliness or a lack of worth, abandonment, anger, or dependency, has become the center of our sense of self. And this sense of self is not a very positive, workable one. In fact, we relate to this core sense of self as quite problematic and threatening. And by the time we're adults, our efforts to avoid the immediate experience of anxiety can result in a state of subtle but chronic anxiety. Jerome wanted to challenge his historic conditioning. Actually, just a side note, I did a really amazing focusing session with someone this week who, and her big kind of epiphany was that she was trying to avoid having these feelings, and her avoidance was actually amplifying the disturbance in herself. It's like her strategy of avoiding it was actually making it amplify. Okay, so anyways, Jerome wanted to challenge his historic conditioning, but to do so, he had to commit to going into his worst fears and dissolving his avoidance strategies. He had to recognize what he didn't want to feel and bring it back into immediate embodied experience. This practice, unfortunately, doesn't make the difficult experience go away. Jerome will likely feel disturbed by conflict for the rest of his life. It does, however, leave us free to engage with our lives more spontaneously because we are willing to have those feelings arise at any moment. We learn that we can feel them and they aren't going to kill us. Gradually, we gain what I think of as the confidence of, so what? So what if I feel uncertain and confused? So what if I feel victimized and dependent? So what if I feel hurtful and alone and selfish? So what? They actually just turn out to be feelings that can be worked with, feelings that don't have to be acted upon. From a Buddhist point of view, our commitment to not feeling disturbing emotions gives rise to a very convincing sense that we have some central essential nature. Our lives indeed seem to be formed around something, and that something feels deeply problematic to us. By practicing our avoidance strategies over and over, day after day, for decades, we become experientially convinced that there must be some central point around which our life revolves. This centerpiece of our being is composed of our core vulnerabilities, which are perceived as problematic. Our life revolves around a problem, and that problem must be our secret self because it's always been there and it never seems to change. Oddly enough, this belief serves us because it means we don't have to consider the possibility that there's no center to our lives and no independently existing self. Instead, we can spend our lives in therapy or spiritual practice trying to somehow heal or take care of seemingly solid problematic self that we've created. At this point, we might attempt to improve our experience of the problem through Western therapy. We might try to experience the no self through spiritual practices like meditation. But we're still motivated by a fundamentally paranoid attitude that there is some problem needing to be fixed. Fundamentally paranoid attitude. There it is, the anxiety, that the definition of it, this like foreboding sense of like maybe something is wrong. And okay, so there's some problem needing to be fixed, but when we actually recover what has been disowned and bring it into our immediate embodied experience and see that it is not going to kill us, we begin to dissolve our sense of having an essential self. We discover that absent of a central struggle, we have no center to our life at all. We just show up each moment and deal with our life as it happens. Okay, the chapter just gets better. I want to read more, but I'm going to stop there.